Well, hello, and thank you for joining this World Data Forum session on statistical legislation. I'm your moderator, Lauren Harrison from Paris 21, and we are pleased to co-host this session with our partners at the Inter-American Development Bank. Statistics laws provide a foundation for statistical development, offering a framework to govern institutions, adhere to core principles, and guide production of official statistics. But how strong is that foundation? The modern data ecosystem, with its explosion of new data actors and sources, has raised both opportunities and challenges for statistical systems globally. While access to information continues to expand in many, though not all cases, public trust in data and facts is under assault. Effective stewardship of data ecosystems has become increasingly complex. This has been brought into sharp relief in the recent COVID-19 pandemic, as demands for data and statistics rise in tandem with public concern around issues of data privacy and quality. The call to strengthen data governance and statistical capacity has, in many ways, never been clearer. Modernizing statistics laws represents a vital step forward in this regard. As the custodian for SDG Indicator 17.18.2, Paris 21 found in 2019 that 132 countries report having statistical legislation in compliance with UN Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics, an increase of 31 countries since 2016. Although this represents substantial progress, more effort is needed, particularly in low and middle income countries, to achieve SDG 17. Statistical legislation provides a guidepost, a North Star, to support and protect national statistical offices and other government entities on the journey towards statistical modernization in these contexts. In addition to providing a legal mandate for official statistics, modern statistics laws address key challenges emerging in the data ecosystem, for example, by parsing the tension between data protection and data access, regulating data exchange between public and private entities, or shaping adoption of digital approaches and emerging technologies. In this light, modernizing statistical legislation is a critical enabler for evidence-based policy, effective governance, and ultimately for sustainable development. But what does this mean in practice? Our panelists today draw on a diverse range of perspectives and experiences at the global, regional, and national levels to unpack the concept of modernizing statistical legislation, identify gaps in current legal frameworks, and offer insights on the way forward. We encourage you to engage with us in the discussion using the Attendify chat function or through social media. Thanks again for joining us. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our distinguished panelists for the discussion. Gabriel Gamez is the Interregional Advisor on Organization and Management of National Statistical Systems at the United Nations Statistics Division in New York since 2015. He is responsible for the implementation and monitoring of various global initiatives and programs to modernize the institutional framework and governance of national statistical systems in support of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and other international and national development policies. He began his professional career at the Swiss Federal Statistical Office in 1991 and was appointed in 2004 as Chief Statistician of the European Free Trade Association. From 2010 to 2015, he served as the Regional Advisor in Statistics at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, or UNECE, in Geneva. Next, Jimena Clark is the Executive Director for the Office of the Dean and the Faculty of Economics and Business of the University of Chile, and has recently served as an independent consultant on statistical institutions for the Inter-American Development Bank and for various national statistics offices in Latin America. Between 2014 and early 2018, she served as National Director for Chile's National Institute of Statistics, or INE, leading the realization of the 2017 Population and Housing Census and the institutional strengthening process, which included the elaboration and legislative processing of a new statistical law for Chile and INE's internal process of modernization. In 2017, the Chilean College of Engineers awarded her the National Management Award in recognition of her professional career. She is the only woman and only public official to receive it to date. Jimena is an economist with a master's degree in economics from Georgetown University and Boston University. Chimita Shring is the director of the National Statistics Bureau of Bhutan. The National Statistics Bureau, or NSB, is the central authority for collection and release of any official data and their custodian. Chimmy was appointed as the director of the NSB in 2017. Before joining the Bureau, he worked at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and the Ministry of Agriculture in various capacities. He holds a master's degree in agricultural economics from Michigan State University. Thank you all very much for your participation today. And with that, we'll begin with some panel presentations. Gabriel, over to you first.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Yes, I mean, legislation is core for statistics, and I'm very pleased to be here. I would like, of course, to thank the Inter-American Development Bank for having invited me as a panelist for this very exciting session. The title of my presentation is Building Trust in Official Statistics, Sound Legal and Institutional Frameworks. I will spend a little bit of time explaining to you why legislation is important for the trust and why trust is important in our world of big data and various data sources. So if I go to the next slide, for me, it's important to make this disambiguation. We often use the word data and statistics a little bit as synonyms. I would like to say that 90% of the data in the world today, if not even more, has been created in the last 2 years. So we have a kind of tsunami, if I can use this terminology, of data coming on us. Now, the thing is that among that data, there is also a lot of white noise, data that are, of course, extremely useful, and some that are less. But something that is fundamental is that raw information, raw data, this tsunami of information, does not speak to most of us. There is a lot of information, but I'm not able to understand this information and then eventually to use it. So what is important, this is the role of statistics, and in particular official statistics, is to convert this raw information, raw data, into knowledge so that the users can take decisions. And for that, let me illustrate this with electricity. I mean, you have on one side, on the left side, you have the producers of electricity, and we can call them the producers of data, right? You have different kind of producers. These one on the top could be the citizen-generated data. The second one could be the censuses and the regular surveys. And the last one could be, for example, big data, right? But all these producers, they're producing high voltage. But high voltage is not useful for the final user. I mean, the universities, the business, the civil society, the individuals, the researchers, they need to charge their smartphones. They can't charge it with high voltage. So you need to transform this high voltage into something that makes sense, that is useful for the users. And this is exactly where I see official statistics, transforming information, raw data, in something that makes sense, that is relevant for the final users. Now the issue is that most of the users can't replicate what official statisticians are doing. And when you can't replicate something that someone is doing for you, you need to work with trust. And trust and quality, that's the core principle or the core value of official statistics. That is based on a certain number of other values that you have here on my slides on the left, like to be accountable, universal, relevant, independent, professional, resilient, which is very important nowadays, right, with the COVID-19, and we will speak a little bit more about that, but also confidential. So basically, if I give my information to official statistics, I know that it will be used only for official statistics and for no other purposes. Internationally, we have a certain number of guidelines that help you actually to protect the trust and increase quality of official statistics. The first one are the UN Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics. The second one are the statistics or the UN National Statistics Quality Assurance Framework. We have very informative regional statistics code of good practices. We have, for example, this one for Latin America. We have the European one. We have the ASEAN one. We have the Caribbean one, etc. And eventually, we have the national statistical legislation. So basically, that's the translation of all these international guidelines and recommendations into something that must be or should be implemented at national level in order to safeguard trust and improve quality in official statistics. One thing that is important in any legislation is to be clear about what are the producers of official statistics, who is under this legislation, who is actually regulated by this statistical law. And this is sometimes a little bit an issue, and we will discuss it also a little bit further later, is that in different countries, it has been sometimes a little bit blurred. Who is producing information for itself, like management data, administrative data, and who is collecting information for official statistical purposes? And basically, we have two main categories. We have in many countries the National Statistical Office. I don't want to discuss that longer here, but we have also, depending on the decentralization of the statistical office, a certain number of other producers of official statistics that will produce the statistics according to the principles and the legislation, and being also professionally independent and following the principle of confidentiality. Now, one other important point is that if we have a system, someone should lead this system, but also represent this system. We have seen in many countries that what we call usually the chief statistician, it's not called chief statistician everywhere, can be a person of very, I would say, a low hierarchical level in the country, so that people don't recognize the chief statistician, and the chief statistician that is not the figure of the national statistical system. And that's why it's important that the chief statistician is the highest statistical authority, getting a direct access to the minister and the president when it exists. The mandate, and you can see a little bit the parallelism with maybe the governor of the central bank, right? The mandate should not be terminated for any reasons compromising the implementation of the law and the principles. You cannot just fire the chief statistician because you don't like the data. Of course, the chief statistician is the lead of the national statistical system, right? Issue standards and guidelines for the entire system. But what is very important and getting more and more importance with the time is this idea of the data stewardship. The chief statistician not only develop the rules, or they'd say the guidelines and the standards within the system, but promote also these rules and standards outside the system, classifications, IT solution, etc., for administrative data, but to some extent also, when possible, to private information. Data sources and confidentiality is an important point. Statisticians should be allowed to use all types of sources to the production of statistics. What we used to call the primary sources, censuses and surveys, the traditional one, and other sources, the secondary sources, not secondary because they are less important, secondary because they have been collected first for other purposes than official statistical purposes. Administrative data, big data, and sometimes citizen-generated data. Of course, the choice has to be made according to quality criteria, cost, burden on respondents, and what is very important, always apply the concept of confidentiality. If statisticians are collecting the data directly through survey or censuses, or if they get them through others like secondary data sources, administrative data and big data, they have to apply to the data they have the principle of confidentiality strictly. Right? And the last point that is important, in good legislation, it is stipulated that producer of official statistics have access to administrative data, and at the micro level, so basically with identifier. Otherwise, of course, the potential of big data cannot be used to its full by producers. producers of official statistics, sorry. I will not spend too much time about the coordination, even though if we have a system, we have a figure that is there, we have principles like the confidentiality, we need also to coordinate it. And there are instruments that are very powerful to coordinate that. We call them I would say the strategic plans or development plans, multi-annual statistical programs, sometimes also the national strategies for the development of statistics. And we have the annual statistical programs or the work programs that are usually, I would say, an operationalization of the multi-annual statistical program. These programs, and this is very important, should cover the entire national statistical system and not only the National Statistical Office. And by doing so, we help the coordination of the overall national statistical system. Here I have a few resources. I mean, if you're interested to read a little bit more, I'm not going to spend more time about that. I'm sure that you will get these slides or access also to these slides afterwards so that you can click on the links and read if you're interested. Thank you very much, Lawrence. I mean, I'm done. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. I think your thoughtful presentation really helps to frame the discussion and demystify some of these issues for us. So really, really valuable. Moving on now to our next panelist to offer a bit of a regional perspective. Jimena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lauren. Well, I'm also very pleased to have the opportunity today to present regarding Latin American countries' statistical legislation. So I'm going to start by sharing my presentation. So as I said, statistical legislation in Latin America, just to have a notion of the context. We know today national statistical system face increasing demand for official statistics. And I'm talking here about quality and timely information, enabling evidence-based decision-making, both for the public sector of public sphere and also the private one. And in the pandemic context, we know also that key elements are the integration of statistical and geographical information, and also the increased access and use of administrative data. So we can combine it with traditional sources and also with new sources of information. So all of these bring us to the need to strengthen countries' statistical capacity, but in a very comprehensive way that is not just regarding management or planning or operational aspect, but also regarding what we should have, which is a very modern and robust regulatory framework that is empowering, for instance, the National Statistical Office to set the guidelines and coordination of the NSS. So with that in mind, I'm going to present the result of this study I did with two colleagues, Daniel Saror and Jose Antonio Mejia, for the IADB regarding legal statistical framework of 18 countries. You have the list of countries here. And when doing the analysis of the statistical regulatory framework, and for that I mean decrees, laws, regulations in general, we used as benchmark the UN Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics, and also many guidelines that were derived from that, such as the Codes of Good Practices from ECLAC, from OECD, and also generic statistical laws, either from Europe or for Latin America. So I'm not going to show you every element which is important, but just to list them. Gabriel was mentioning many of them. And so there are things like professional independence, the existence of principles, statistical councils, mandates for data collections, access to sources of information, confidentiality, quality assessment, dissemination policy. All of these are the very essential elements that any modern statistical legislation should include. Now, regarding the result, I will be showing them in this table and for Latin American countries. And the first thing to notice is that in some countries, we do have a very high level of norm dispersion. And this is already a complicated thing, because whenever you need to know who should do what in the national statistical system, at least you need to have a clear rule. And this clear rule sometimes is in many places. So this is a problem to start. Then, by looking at the content of the legislations, one characteristic is that in general, there are no principles and no definitions in the statistical legislations. And part of that is because we are talking here about very old laws. For instance, Paraguay 1942 or El Salvador 55 or many others from the 60s and the 70s. There are some exceptions. Costa Rica is one of them with one of the newest legislations, Mexico, Panama, Uruguay, Venezuela. They all include principles and definitions, although they do not always coincide. And now the important thing of having principles is that you define statistical, official statistics by those that are compliant with these principles and to the law. And so if you don't have that, it's sometimes very difficult to differentiate what is an official statistic and what is not. Then, most legislations explicitly define the NSS in the statistical laws, but in general, just by describing its members. And there are some exceptions though. When we look at the role of the NSO, we find that legislations are not explicit in defining this stewardship role that Gabriel was talking about. Not a mention regarding setting guidelines or coordinations. And there are some exceptions again, but in general, what we find is that there is just some very implicit mentions regarding a role in terms of coordination. And again, this is a big problem. Then we look at professional independence, and in particular for the NSO authority. You can see here in the very red column that this is also a very big problem. When looking at this concept, we check if the law explicitly defines the conditions for appointment and or for dismissal of the NSO authority, which is something very important, or if the authority is elected in open competition, if it's based on technical competencies for fixed term and ideally for an overlapped term with the government one. The result is that in most countries, we do not even have two conditions out of 5. And that reveals that appointment in general are based on political decisions. And this is, again, this is a big problem. We have exceptions, Costa Rica and Mexico, but in general, you can see it's a very problematic issue, this one. Then we look at statistical programs, statistical councils also. Most legislations do include programs, but they do not explicit what the program should include. So even when it is supposed to be a very good tool in terms of coordination, in general is a weak tool. And then statistical councils are in most laws also, but only in some cases, they include users of official statistics. And the importance of having a statistical advisory councils with users is that you can get from them the feedback you need in order to answer to this increasing demand for statistics. And this is in the law. When you look at the practice, many of these councils do not really work in practice. Then regarding unrestricted access to administrative data, this is not ensured at all by the laws. There are exceptions. Costa Rica is one of them, and they are very explicit in saying that the access has to be unrestricted. It is a new law, so we still need to check if this is going to work, but it is very important to be explicit, and Mexico is the other one. But for the rest, in 10 out of 18 countries, we have an insufficient level of access, and in 1/3 of the countries, we have no access at all. And this brings us to a problem of efficiency, really, and we can talk about that later. Now, a good thing regarding safeguarding confidentiality in general, this is something that countries comply with. The only thing is that whenever we look for framework for sanctioning, for instance, for violation of statistical secret, or whenever respondents that do not want to provide data, the sanctioning framework tends to be weak. So there is the space there also to improve. Now, regarding dissemination policy, You can see again a very red column. In general, this is not part of the statistical legislation. So with this 10 dimension, we can elaborate an indicator which simply accounts for how many red cells every country has. And this is this last column. You can see that just 2 countries have 90% of compliance, few others 40%, and for the rest, at most 30%. So the answer to the question on the top is unfortunately, is a big no. As a conclusion, we have here that Latin American countries exhibit significant gaps regarding what the statistical regulation should be. Just 2 countries are complying with the UN fundamental principles. And that means that just 2 countries are complying with this SDG indicator that was supposed to be set by today, 2020. For the rest of the countries, we have a very weak statistical framework, and we can infer that that implies difficulties also to create evidence-based public policy. Based on the table we just saw, and in my opinion also, the 3 biggest weaknesses are access to administrative data, professional independence, and release and dissemination policy. And that in turn implies a problem of lack of efficiency, of legitimacy, and of transparency respectively. And this is a huge problem of trust. And I should say here, it's not just trust on NSO or NSS, but on the government. How can you trust government that is supposed to elaborate public policy based on evidence when you see such a weak regulatory framework or such a weak statistical capacity? As I said before, this is a huge problem. Now, today we have diagnoses for not just Latin America, but for the rest of the regions. We have guidelines, we have even generic statistic law. So if we do not have a strong statistical regulation, it's not because of lack of input, it's rather because of another problem. Maybe it's political willingness. Maybe we as a statistical community, we haven't been able to elaborate strategic plans with strategic alliances with users, for instance, academia or civil society, in order to push for a better regulation. And just coming back to the current context, I have to say that COVID-19 is not to blame for these gaps, but it is showing us how countries with a weak statistical capacity and regulation are far behind regarding what societies are demanding from their NSS today. And I'm really sorry to say that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jimena. Really helpful, I think, to see that clear kind of comparative analysis of these different gaps and ultimately how that has some significant impacts down the line. So quickly, we'll go ahead and last but not least, move to our final panelist. Chimi, over to you for the perspective from Bhutan.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you for having me as one of the panelists. First of all, the topic in my presentation is Bhutan's path to establish a statistical legal framework. Just to start with Bhutan, I would like to mention that Bhutan do not have a Statistical Act as yet. And in our region, in South Asia, Bhutan is the only country without a statistical legal framework. So the national statistical system in Bhutan operates under an executive order that was issued by the government in 2016. So this executive order designates National Statistics Bureau as the central statistical authority for collection, compilation, and release of any official statistics. So NSB, the vision of National Statistics Bureau is to provide quality statistical products and services to support the socio-economic development of the country. And National Statistics Bureau is involved in producing statistics on economics, environmental, population, and social statistics, as well as National Statistics Bureau is involved with any statistical activities at the national as well as international levels. So among others, one of the main challenges that the national statistical system in Bhutan is facing is the increasing and evolving demand for quality statistics, not only in the light of recent global pandemic, but also to support evidence-based decision-making, and to support the planning, progress monitoring, and evaluation of development activities, as well as for the SDG monitoring and reporting, which requires disaggregated data to ensure that no one is left behind, and also to support transparency, accountability, and the management of effective management of the public service delivery in Bhutan. So while there is increasing demand of quality data, the national statistical system is not without any limitations or weaknesses. So among others, some of the weaknesses that we are confronted with is data gaps and inconsistencies in data, which is impacting in terms of reliability as well as in terms of comparability of data. And the other one is weak coordination and collaboration among the data producers as well as with the data users, which is resulting in terms of wastage of resources, duplication of efforts, and poor quality statistics. The other one is lack of capacity and skills in terms of trying to adapt to the emerging technologies as well as to use non-traditional sources of data. And the other one is we lack national standards and harmonized methods, which is again impacting the reliability, consistency, as well as comparability of data. And the other limitations are limited use of data in decision making, declining responses to household surveys, and limited awareness about the statistics and its value. So these are the limitations that we are confronted with at this moment. So the way forward after consulting and deliberating within the statistical system as well as with external agents, the only option to address these limitations or weaknesses is to enact a statistical law. So therefore, Bhutan started drafting a statistical bill since 2015, essentially benchmarking from the generic law of official statistics. So we imagine and hope that the Statistical Act will streamline the roles and responsibilities and show some clarity in terms of processes and the systems, as well as strengthen the coordination of statistical activities to achieve efficiency in the statistical system. And also through this statistical law, we hope that there will be, it will ensure organizational and professional independence, as well as guarantee integrity and accountability of the national statistical system to produce high quality statistics with objectivity and impartiality. And other one is through this statistical bill, we hope to promote international best practices within the statistical system, essentially following what has been prescribed in the UN Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics. And also through this bill, the bill will provide a legal basis to collect the data, protection of confidentiality, as well as it would facilitate easy access to data. So these are the benefits. We anticipate these benefits from the statistical bill that is at the draft stage. And this is the last slide. Here we have rules of procedure for drafting a bill, which was introduced in 2018. And as per the rules of procedure, first thing that we have to do is we have to submit a proposal to draft a bill to the cabinet, and that proposal should include a regulatory forward plan as well as the regulatory impact assessment. So once the cabinet approves this proposal, then the agency will start drafting the bill. So after in the process of drafting, the consultations also happen in parallel. So after the bill is being drafted, the final bill is submitted to the Office of the Attorney General for their review. So once the Office of the Attorney General is satisfied with the final draft, then we present it to the cabinet. And if the cabinet approves, then we submit it to the parliament. So once it is submitted to the parliament, the minimum time frame that takes is around 1 year to pass the bill. So sometimes it may take more than 1 year as well. But in terms of the, when it comes to the statistics, the Bhutan statistics bill, since we have the draft bills since 2015, before this rules of procedure is in place, so therefore we follow a different path. That is, so we have a draft statistical bill, then that is, the draft bill is being consulted with the stakeholders. Then after that, we do a rapid impact assessment. We, in the sense, the rapid impact assessment unit under the cabinet secretariat will do the regulatory impact assessment. Then it is sent to the Office of the Attorney General for their review. And then after that, if everything is goes well, then we present it to the cabinet and then to the, submit it to the parliament. So currently the status is that, as I've mentioned, we have a draft statistic bill since 2015, and we have requested Paris 21 to review and revise the draft, which is done sometime end of 2019. But now what is the next step that is due is consultation, take it for consultation with the stakeholders. But we were not able to do that because of the COVID situation. And however, we are hopeful that the situation will improve, and we will be able to at least submit to the cabinet for for the approval before the end of 2020, end of this year. So with this, I end my presentation. Thank you. Back to you, Lauren.
Thanks so much, Chimi. Really helpful perspective from the national level on all the different steps in the process, and also understanding how this ultimately relates back to creating an enabling environment to strengthen statistical capacity in Bhutan. So I think we've had some great presentations, and thank you to all of you for setting the stage for the conversation so well with all these different points. I want to move to some discussion. First I'll kind of break the ice a little bit with a question for all of you. In light of the various perspectives that you've all brought in your presentations. I think as Jimena noted, there's a lot of laws that are on the books. As Jimmy noted, there's still laws that are still in development. What does it really mean to modernize statistical legislation? What are we going for here? And what do we see as sort of the essential must-haves to move from models that are maybe outdated or no longer fit for purpose in sort of the modern data ecosystem? And how do we move forward? What are those kind of core elements? And maybe I'll go to Gabrielle first, and then we'll hand it along. But just some quick reactions to those points. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this question, Lauren. I mean, I would like also to thank Jimena and Chime for their excellent presentations. I think we have been extremely well, coordinated or actually complementary in our presentations. And I really like just to emphasize a few points that, unfortunately, because of the 10 minutes that we had a little bit to take away. I feel that the importance of the Statistical Council is core. This is something that is very important. And why the Statistical Council is important, it's because in general, it represents the user communities. And this is fundamental to understand that the statistical law is not there to protect the statistical office. The statistical law is there to ensure the rights of the users and the rights for confidentiality of the data providers. This is core. If people understand that, and of course the political context in the country is open to transparency, and we discussed that, and I'm happy that some other people mentioned that and not me as representing the UN. But I mean, if this is true and is there, then of course, with this kind of communication explaining that this, we don't do it for the sake of the statistical office, but the sake of the users and the data providers, I think that this is already a big step. Last point, users and data providers can be the respondent to survey or data providers as, for example, administrative data. They're sometimes the same, right? They're often actually the same. We all have been once in our life a data provider, and at the same time, we are all data users. This is my answer, Lauren. Thank you. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Gabriel. I think that those are great points, and thinking about how this ultimately is brokering a relationship with the public, I think is really key. And in many ways, it sort of grounds this, rather technical issue in something that is, you can see ultimately is really connected to governance and also to good policy and just generally development as a whole. So maybe I'll hand now to Jimena for your quick reaction. Again, what are those kind of core essential elements when we're thinking about modernizing statistical legislation? Thanks.
Thank you, Lorraine. Well, what I think is, well, to start these essential elements that I was listed on the presentation, but if I have to choose just one, I would say that having access to administrative data, it is really essential. And of course, I agree with what Gabriel just said, but having access to administrative data makes a whole difference in terms of being able to respond to an increasing demand for statistics and with limited resources also. So we need to be very efficient here in order to provide a granular statistic, which is something that is very needed and is very far from what we provide today. Then having access, it doesn't mean that you immediately transform that to official statistic. Of course, you need to check what is the quality of information. You need to work hand in hand with those institutions that collect those type of data. But at the end of the day, you can have a very win-win situation in which we all understand how to collect data, how to use it, and how to elaborate official statistics. And then the second must-have, I really think, is this issue of professional independence, which is a real problem in many countries. And here I would like to say that one funny thing, which is not that funny, but one kind of funny thing is that whenever you ask directors of NSOs if they feel they are professionally independent, they will say, we used to say, yes, of course. But as soon as you have a change of government, what you see if that there is a change of this authority, this NSO director, or sometimes as soon as you have a change of a minister to whom you are related, or for any reason any political authority didn't like something that you did, you are always at risk of being changed. And this is a very strong examples of this lack of professional independence. Now, the problem with that is that whenever you want to do a real transformation of the NSO or of the NSS, you need medium or long-term projects. But with this kind of uncertainty, because you can be changed at any time, it is very difficult for you and for your teams to plan with not even 2-3 years. And that is a problem if we are thinking here of strengthening the statistical capacity of countries. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jimena. And yeah, I completely agree. And I think that also opens, I think, some interesting touch points we can talk a little bit about maybe momentarily on how COVID-19 has really, I think, blown up some of this concern around access to these different data sources and also to sort of the integrity of institutions. And we can touch on that maybe momentarily. But first I want to go to Timmy. You gave us a really good insight on how this process is unfolding in Bhutan and some of the key motivations. And now that you have a draft law you're thinking about, I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on this question of, what do you see as kind of these core elements you're trying to bring in to this new piece of legislation in Bhutan? Over to you, Chimi.
Thank you, Lauren. I think to me, as I've mentioned, among the elements, I think what is important, three important elements, if I may mention, is one is that there should be guarantee of organizational and professional independence. So that is one important aspect. And the other one is that the law should guarantee the integrity and accountability of the statistical system. So here, what I would mention is, while you have professional independence, at the same time, the professionals or the statisticians should be made accountable for what they are doing. So this is also very important. And the third thing is the law should facilitate in terms of producing quality statistics, as well as in terms of using technologies, emerging technologies, in terms of partnership with the development partners, and also it should encourage using new data sources. So these are some of the elements that are essential to modernize the statistical system. Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks so much, Chimi. And I'm just going to segue directly. I think you all have raised, I think there were about 5 or 6 in there, really core elements around accountability, data access, governance frameworks, engaging with users. In the context of COVID-19, where we're thinking about obviously data and statistics, and in many ways the public is thinking more about data and statistics now than they ever have. How has that changed the state of play, do you think, for developing and pushing for more modern statistical legislation, and how can the statistical legislation ultimately build toward better future resilience? Maybe I'll go to Jimena first, and then we'll go around a little bit. Thanks.
Well, in the current context, I think that we have seen how problematic it is not to have a good statistical legislation that would have brought us a very different scenario in which, for instance, every time you have a statistic or data from the health authorities, you wouldn't have such problems of interpretations we see today in many countries. So there you have a problem. Now, what I think is that today it's clearer than ever that people tend to think on the urgent and not on the important. So I haven't seen anyone pushing for improving the statistical legislation because of COVID-19, but I have seen people realizing how bad it is not to have worked at an update of the legislation prior to this crisis. So, I mean, it is late for today, but it shouldn't be late for the next challenges or crises that we may have in the future.
Great, thanks, Jimena. I mean, I really liked especially your point on how COVID has really changed, this kind of dynamic of something that's urgent but not important. And I think it's really a challenge right now in some respects to mobilize around these issues, but hopefully at the same time it's creating more clarity on what's needed, and so hopefully we can progress. Chimi, I wonder if I could just turn to you quickly. You mentioned that COVID has also slowed a bit the process in Bhutan, from the consultation dimension. That's practical considerations, of course. Has there been a change also, though, in demand or maybe recognition for the need for the new law, would you say? Just some reflections on your side of how COVID may be affecting the process in Bhutan.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm not sure if they recognize the importance of the statistical law, but under the current situation, I can confidently say that the systems or the different agencies have definitely realized the importance of data, to deal with this COVID situation. Just to mention, in Bhutan, we have a technical advisory group to deal with the pandemic, as well as there were several committees. Initially when we started, the National Statistics Bureau was hardly part of those statistics. But later on, these different committees and advisory groups realized the importance of statistics. So they have started inviting, NSP to be part of those committees. So therefore, there is definitely a recognition of the importance of data and statistics. When it comes to this statistical legislation, without a legislation, what I personally felt was the visibility and the prominence of the National Statistical Office is compromised. I feel if we have a Statistical Act in place, that would really, help in terms of the importance of the National Statistical Office. So therefore, we have been really advocating for the Statistical Act, and rightly so. I think we need one, and hopefully the government will realize the importance of a statistical bill. Thank you, Lauren.
Great. Thanks so much for those insights, Chime. I mean, I think it's really encouraging to hear that, of course, that the NSB is being invited into the response process. And, certainly, I think that's a promising sign toward building some momentum toward the recognition of the need for strong statistical systems. And so we'll be eager to continue to support you, of course, on the Paris 21 side as well. Gabriel, so from your side, looking a little bit on the global perspective and thinking a bit about how maybe COVID has altered the lens or perhaps built some momentum toward improving statistical legislation and the enabling environment for data and statistics. Could you reflect a bit on that for us? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lauren. I mean, the thing what is very important is that we don't have only a statistical legislation to protect the trust or to enhance the trust of users in official statistics. What we also want is actually to support resilient and agile national statistical systems, and in particular, national statistical offices. We need to allow, and it was mentioned by Jimena as well as by Chime, we need to allow the National Statistical Office and the other producers of official statistics to get access to other sources of information, and Jimena mentioned, administrative data, in order to make possible for these producers of official statistics rather quickly to respond to pressing needs and demands. This is fundamental. With the COVID-19, but it's not the first crisis. We had already the financial crisis. We had then we had then the sustainable development goals, and we say, hey, how are we going to produce the information? We have the Paris Accord. How are we going to produce all this environmental information? And now we have the COVID. It's only one time more that we realize that we have to be agile and resilient. This is something that is extremely important. I would advise, in order to be agile, to have statistical legislations that are as light as possible. The importance is that the principles that secure the independence, that secure the trust, that secure resilience are in, but all the other elements like the number of staff members, the number of deputies, take them out. Don't leave them in the law. Put them in the bylaw, in the decree, presidential decree, for example, or governmental one, because you don't want each time you have to reorganize your statistical office, and we need to do it constantly. You don't want to reopen the Pandora box and go to the parliament to change your law. So please be simple, focus on what is important, and leave the rest for bylaws, decrees, and so on. So this is my advice. Law is here also for resilient and agile national statistical offices. We had actually an agenda on transforming national statistical system. We were in different regions promoting that. This is one element. We are working at the moment, development account 14 for the United Nations, probably 10 entities of the UN Secretariat that will discuss and support countries in providing response information or to inform the response to COVID-19. And one important component of that will be the institutional and legal framework. So we're taking care of that, Jimena, and I will be very happy to continue working with you on that. And Chime too, of course.
Thanks so much, Gabriel, and very encouraging to hear the progress as well on these new initiatives and frameworks. I think the issue you raised on that the objective should be agility and speed, which of course doesn't always play to our strengths, I think. And I think it's also important to recognize that the statistics laws don't exist in isolation, right? It's this idea of keeping it light and offering a framework within which there can be some progress and evolution, I think is really key. And something hopefully we can take these lessons forward. As you said, it's not the first crisis, but we'll continue to look for progress in key areas. So I think what I'll do now is I'll move to just a few targeted questions for each of you on some of the reflections on each of your presentations and the perspectives that you will bring. So I'm going to go first to Chime. I think in the beginning of your presentation, you really laid out, I think, some core capacity challenges that you are looking at in Bhutan, which I think in many ways, a lot of countries, a lot of statistical offices can relate to. And I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on how, when this new law does come into effect, how will that open new opportunities to enhance capacity? So in which way is it going to be, I think, catalytic for the development of statistics in Bhutan? Over to you, Chime.
First of all, I'd like to thank Gabriel for the advice to keep the law light and simple as possible for resilience and agility. I think that's a very good advice. So which is quite relevant to Bhutan because we are still in the drafting stage. So thank you for that. So when it comes to the question, I think in terms of capacity building, I think to have an effective capacity building, I think we need to have a comprehensive strategic plan in place. And to have this strategic plan, I think first of all, leadership is important. Secondly, the clarity of roles and responsibilities within the statistical system is important. And the third thing is, I think there should be effective coordination within the system, coordination and collaboration. And as well as we need adequate resources, both in terms of financial as well as staff, financial as well as the staff. So these are the essential elements to have a comprehensive strategic plan for capacity development within the system, as well as to implement it effectively. So I feel that the statistical law provides clarity for all these essential elements. So therefore, I feel this statistical law will really help in terms of building capacity and developing the skills that we are looking for. And as well as, again, I think in the law, there's a provision that provides for international cooperations with the donors. So that will also help us in terms of capacity building. So these are the things I think that the new law will contribute in terms of capacity building in the statistical system. Thank you, Lauren.
Great, thank you, Chimi. And yeah, I think the 4 elements you outlined, and just the need for clarity, really, that it does create kind of an environment to pursue a mandate to develop capacity is really key. And I think balanced against Gabrielle's good insight on, you know, keeping things sufficiently light. So it's a good counterpoint there as well. Maybe to Jimena now, returning a bit to your comparative analysis in Latin America. And I think, you know, you've talked a little bit about, you know, a few of these points in your other reflections, but, you know, what do you see as kind of the most common limitations, you know, looking a bit under the surface of a few of these countries that you've been examining? That really can be addressed in the process of modernizing legislation. Thanks so much.
Well, I think the most common one is access to data, basically. And I keep saying that, but it's a real problem with, for instance, response rate that are decreasing today for most of the surveys in most of the countries. You really need to have access to some other data. And so there is, as I said, there is no good access to administrative data. And when there is, it's not in the format or with the frequency you need it. In general, it's not nominated data. And then the mandate for data collection in general is very weak. In general, you do not have provisions in terms of enforcing this mandate. So the cost of not responding to the NSO or any other producer of official statistic is very low. Sometimes you have processes and you have a procedure with some sanctions or fines, but given that these are very old laws, the fines are in a currency that sometimes not even exists, or in terms of a level that really doesn't make any difference. So I keep saying access to data, in particular administrative data, but also the mandate of respondents to answer is something very, very weak. And I should consider that the first thing to address in the legislation.
Great, thank you. Now, I think ultimately the access question, it's really, I think, clear in all of our minds, particularly as, you know, there's just more data producers now than ever. And, you know, thinking about how to set up laws to, I think, grow with the ecosystem to address this access problem in a sustainable way, but also, you know, continuing to build an environment where we're encouraging people to participate and respond and provide, you know, the inputs needed to produce really comprehensive, robust official statistics. It's, you know, obviously something that's just really, really key in this discussion. So last, I'll move once more to Gabrielle. So we see, and you mentioned a few of them, I think, in your presentation, but there's a lot of emerging guidance now to support processes of modernization. And we see, you know, that actually there's a lot of cross-cutting challenges that countries face. Jimena showed that there were numerous countries that had, you know, similar issues. And Chimi, in many ways, as I mentioned earlier, I think his points on what they're trying to address are often fairly universal for a lot of statistical institutions. That said, now that we have a lot more guidance, you know, what do you see as the challenges countries might face in adapting the generic statistics law, for example, or other guidance that's available to their context? How do they really bring this home in their environment? So over to you, Gabrielle.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Yeah, it's a tricky question, right? I mean, we would have the perfect answer to that one. We would all have perfect, modern statistical legislations. There are probably many reasons. The first one we mentioned before, there must be a kind of, I would say, political maturity in a country that allows actually for transparency and evidence-based decision-making. If there is not this maturity, of course, I mean, there is not a push in favor of a modern statistical legislation, right? there is always a danger with information, right? Because we say the truth. And in a world where we hear so many things that are not verified, not to call them differently, I mean, we are a little bit in a danger zone. Now, I would also mention that, as you mentioned before, one size does not fit all. We have the generic legislation, but every country has its culture, its history, its structure when it comes to the production of data and statistics. And we have to adapt this to the specific context of a given country. Some regions are rather homogeneous, and then it helps because what you do in one country, you can more or less replicate in others. But in some other regions, they can be so different that it's sometimes difficult. Copy-paste does not exist, and we know that. Now, the other thing I wanted to say also is that in the revision process, there are sometimes a few steps that we forget. And I think the first one is advocacy and consultation. Advocacy is fundamental to explain why do we need a new law, but not only with the government. Often it's done only with the government. It's only when the government says, okay, for a new law that we start to speak with the users. We should start with the public, the civil society, the data community, the medias, the businesses, very early to tell them what are their interests as users to get a new law. It's very important that we identify champions. There are people in the country that would promote the revision of the law. When we promote it, it looks like we have a hidden agenda there. If we take people outside, I mean, people believe that, right? So that's very important. We should seek support from the international community, and this we know that, and that's why we're all here. It's very, very important, and I thank again the Inter-American Development Bank for that. Exchange experience with countries that are in the process or recently revised their statistical legislation. Other countries are in process, other countries have done it recently, maybe we can learn from them, right? And another point, very early in the process, to identify all the other laws in the countries and bylaws that need to be aligned at the moment we get the statistical legislation. Because once we get it, there are many other laws that have to be adapted. And in some countries, they come to a bottleneck in the way that they have the law and they have a deadline to align all other legislation for the law to be implemented. And if they miss it, it's finished, it's over, right? So this is a very, very important point. And as Jimena said, it's not only about having a law. We have to implement it and we have to enforce it. And sometimes we don't implement and enforce it even when we have a modern one. And this is really a pity. That was my last word. Thank you very much, Lauren.
Thanks so much, Gabriel. I think that that is indeed a really good point to move toward closing now. But I want to thank the whole panel for their really active participation, such an interesting conversation. And, you know, I think really inspiring to think about how we can continue to progress on an agenda for better statistical legislation and ultimately for better statistical development overall. And so I just want to thank the audience for joining us. We hope the session has been informative and inspiring for you to learn more about what statistical modernization means. Again, we encourage you to keep the conversation going by providing comments in the Attendify chat function or reaching out to us through social media platforms. And on behalf of Paris 21 and IADB, thank you very much for joining us and best wishes for a great virtual World Data Forum. Thanks.